Well, Egypt is preparing to host a high-level Hamas delegation for talks on a new truce in the Gaza conflict. Cairo says it has put forward a three-stage proposal. Details of this plan will only be made public after it receives feedback from relevant parties. Hamas has warned that hostages will only be released if a permanent ceasefire between Israel and Hamas is put in place. The fresh round of negotiations comes as Israel intensifies its offensive on the enclave. More than 100,000 displaced people are crowding into the city of Rafah, following Israel's evacuation orders to move further south, but nowhere is safe. Israeli airstrikes have pounded the city and Khan Yunis, killing dozens. Israel's widening campaign has already flattened much of northern Gaza and emptied it of most of its inhabitants, isolating it from the rest of the territory. Hamas says more than 21,500 Palestinians have been killed since the start of the war, following Hamas's attack on Israel on the 7th of October. Aid workers also not spared. The director of the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian Refugees says Israeli soldiers have fired at an aid convoy as it was returning from northern Gaza along a route designated by the army. More Trent Murray joins us live from Tel Aviv. Trent, do we have any idea how these new truce talks are progressing?
Well, we've been given some detail, according to Egyptian state media, around what the framework entails. As you said, it is a three-stage framework which is being put to the parties. We understand the first stage includes a 2-week ceasefire in exchange for 40 hostages being returned from Hamas captivity. That would focus on women, children and those with medical conditions. The Israeli army would also remove its tanks and 120 Palestinians would be released from Israeli custody in jails here in Israel. The next stage would then involve what's being described as the Palestinian National Talk, where effectively all of the factions involved in Palestinian politics, including Hamas and the Palestinian Authority, would sit down to try and settle their differences in order to try and potentially form a technocratic government that could then go in and try to rebuild Gaza and run its affairs. And then the third stage is a comprehensive ceasefire, complete withdrawal of Israel from Gaza and all of the hostages then released and for people to be able to return to their homes in the north. Look, it's an ambitious set of goals. It's one that the Egyptians have been working hard on, they say. I think the real sticking point will be the fact that that technocratic government that they have floated the idea of would include Hamas. Now, for Israel, that essentially is a non-starter. Their public rhetoric and their statements have been they want to see Hamas eliminated completely. But the negotiators are saying that that is just not realistic because Hamas is so embedded in the political system of Gaza and in the power structures that getting rid of them completely is not viable. So, look, we'll have to see the eventual outcome of these negotiations. Many parties involved. There are two very, very different camps in terms of their perspectives. But nevertheless, those negotiators are trying to bridge those divides to see if they can find an off-ramp, if you will, out of this conflict for Israel so the civilians in that besieged area can be spared any more fighting.
All right, Trent mentioned being spared fighting. The Israeli offensive expanding to the south. What is the humanitarian situation like on the ground?
Yeah, the IDF calling in reinforcements as it moves its operation further south. We have seen an airstrike in Rafah in the past couple of hours. The Palestinian media sources on the ground are saying 20 people were killed in that airstrike, and it just shows how difficult things are, because if you look at a map of Gaza, you will see that Rafah is right up against the border of Egypt. You cannot get any further south, and this is what the UN has been warning about, that people are being shuffled around away from the fighting, but even in the areas they're being evacuated to, there are still airstrikes taking place. Now, for the IDF's part, it says it believes that the Hamas leadership is hiding out in that part of the strip, in particular in the underground tunnel network, and they're working to detect and destroy them. But while that fighting happens, we know that civilians are being caught in the crossfire. The Hamas-run health ministry says over 21,000 people have now been killed. And for those that are trying to live there, well, we understand there are long lines for food, not enough humanitarian aid getting in. And the UN agencies are warning that the entire strip is at risk of famine unless much more humanitarian aid is surged into the strip and fast.
Well, thanks for that. Trent Murray reporting live to us there from Tel Aviv.